So first thing first, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, cool. So look, my name's Joseph Coyne. I come from this small town in New Zealand, actually, called Tolaga Bay, which is like a town of 600 people. So New Zealand, Far East Coast, New Zealand's first place where Captain Cook, James Cook, landed in New Zealand, and also one of the first places in the world where to see the sun. So I grew up in this small little town in New Zealand, went to university in New Zealand, moved over to Australia to start basically to play a little bit of what we call park footy or semi-professional rugby league. And I had experience playing rugby union. And as part of that, in New Zealand, every able-bodied male grows up playing rugby union. And as part of that, in my off seasons from rugby union, I did some beach sprinting, which is like a sport in New Zealand and Australia with surf life saving, and I also did a little bit of track training. And this actually helped me so much with my footy, with my rugby, and I really became a believer in it and fell in love with the sport. And actually, I probably had fallen in love with the sport, like sprinting in general, far before then. Like one of my favorite athletic memories was Michael Johnson winning the 200, 400 in Atlanta. So he's like, it was actually I actually got to meet Michael in person after the Rio Olympics, and that was one of my real sort of starstruck moments. But yeah, anyway, so I'd had this sort of background as using sprinting to help myself, and to sort of experience some of the training methods. And when I started out working as a trainer and S&C coach in Australia, and I started helping a lot of sprinters in Australia, and especially beach sprinters. Where I'm from, where we live right now, there's a very high amount of beach sprinters. It's just the nature of the sport. Surf lifesaving is really, really concentrated where I live. And so what happened from there? One of my friends was working in China. He got his boss at the time they wanted some, because I had all the experience sprinting. They actually wanted somebody to come over and work with Chinese track and field. And I didn't actually get that contract that they had actually fell through with the people that they were working with. It was with Exos. So Exos Athletes Performance at the time, they were looking for somebody to come over. My name got recommended. That contract actually fell through. But after that, another contract came up over in China, and I got the nod for that one. That was as the performance manager with the Chinese Olympic Committee's National Sports Training Center. So I went over and did that job. When I was there, I started working with some of the track and field athletes, especially around sort of testing and diagnostics, and helping out, in particular, Randy Huntington with some of the sort of testing results for his long jumpers that he was coaching at the time. And then Athletes Performance, they actually lost the contract with the Chinese Olympic Committee, and I got hired on. By that time, I had a little bit of experience with track and field, and I basically got hired on as Randy's right-hand man for the next sort of 18 months, almost 2 years. So in that time, I just got exposed to so much good track and field knowledge, not just from Randy, but from other coaches, Chinese coaches. I learned a truckload from a lot of good Chinese coaches on the national team. Guys like Damien Inocenio, who's a pole vault coach. I learned a lot from him. They had people like Lauren Seagrave come out and consult and help coach the men's relay team. And I worked across all the sprint and jump department in my time there. So I worked with high jump, long jump, and the sprinters, essentially the 4x100 and the men's and females and the male sprinters. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background in track and field. Since then, I came home to Australia to do a PhD. Halfway through that, I got a job offer to go back to China, this time for a totally different sport, the UFC, which is UFC Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I headed up the Performance Institute and set up all the systems in that for the first 2 years. That was really COVID interrupted, and COVID was a massive roadblock on that job. And I ended up coming home after that. I've been back home in Australia for the last year and a bit since that job finished up, coaching out of a university and a high school. So yeah, that's a bit about myself.
Cool. So I noticed that you've been training with some top athletes like Su Bingtian, right?
Yep.
So for those like 100 meter sprinter or like 200-meter sprinter, that how strong are they?
You'd be surprised. So some of them, like Sue, when I worked with him, wasn't very strong, and there were definitely um, components of his physical preparation where there were really big gains to be made. Like there was really big windows of opportunities, especially in the lower leg. And so when he actually started getting coached by Randy, this was something that Randy jumped on from my knowledge anyway, without being there day to day, because he wasn't being coached by Randy in my time with the athletics team. And yeah, look, there were components that he wasn't that strong in. He also had a back condition that limited potentially what he could do. So yeah, his for Sue, he probably was at a limit where a little bit more strength would have helped him in my time, and we did some work on that, and more specific strength to the muscles that you use and the muscles that are really involved in sprinting fast, like your hamstrings, your lower leg, your calf, your glutes, things like that. That was definitely something. But look, in general, to be strong enough to sprint fast, the general rule of thumb is around 1.8 to 2 times your body weight. Being able to squat that would tick most boxes. Now, that doesn't mean you can't run very fast without hitting those numbers. People do it all the time, and there's a whole heap of different body shapes. Your longer legs, shorter torso people, they might be a different kettle of fish as well. So yeah, it's although that's a real general rule of thumb, guideline, it's definitely not something that I would insist that you have to have before you can run fast.
So I also noticed that for like sprinting or like jumping, you use like force velocity profiling, right? Can you like
Yes, I have.
So can you like explain it to us like how the force velocity profiling works?
Yeah, so there's generally two types of force velocity profiling. From and I'm talking about the things that have been published from Samazino and JB Morin is the collaborator. But Samazino, there's two types. There's one is a jump, a vertical force velocity profile, and the other one is a sprint, a horizontal force velocity profile. So the jump, essentially, you will do a movement, whether it's a jump or a sprint, and both with at body weight and then with additional loads. This will tell us what type of slope your force velocity profile is. Is it a very steep slope, i.e., you produce more force than velocity, or is it a very shallow slope, you produce less force and more velocity? And based, at least in the jump, they have, based on your limb length and also the power you can produce, they have an optimal force velocity slope where you can compare your one to what theoretically the optimal slope should be. So sprinting doesn't have that, and they have actually looked at, in some recent research, they have actually looked at providing that, but I don't think the results were very good. And the sprinting one, essentially, it's based off time, and to a degree the jumping one as well. It's time in the air can be used for the calculation of jump height, which is then inferred what happens with the power. But yeah, you can compare a person's in the jump at least, which will you can compare a person's force velocity slope to give you an indication of what type of training they should be doing, whether they should be doing more force specific training, e.g. heavy weights, or more velocity specific training, e.g. lighter weights, faster work, sprinting in essence, or something in the middle, a balanced profile. You can kind of also do that with the sprinting profile as well. Although, like I said, it doesn't have this optimal force velocity slope. And for me, and there's a little bit of conjecture out there, what you get from the force velocity profile is really similar to just analyzing the splits. And if a person is poor in the 0 to 5 and 0 to 10, then you're going to have to work more acceleration work, more weighted locomotive strength work, like weighted sleds, that type of thing, versus if they're poor in the 20 to 30 segment, or 25 to 30, or 20 to 25, they're going to have to work more maximum velocity methods, okay, in the sprinting. One interesting thing about the jump force velocity profile is you can change the angle to which you theoretically apply it. So if you're going straight up and down like a volleyball player or a basketball player, you'll need more force than if you're going out at like a 40-degree angle, like say a sprinter will be, or even a swimmer will be in the start of 100 meters, or any block start in swimming besides backstroke. So that's another thing that I've used in the past to specifically target somebody's start and the amount of force they produce out of somebody's start. And I think the jump force velocity profile has a lot of application to sprinting and the start, especially.
So for the jumping force velocity profiling and the sprinting force velocity profiling, let's say if if I test him with the jumping force velocity profiling and the sprinting force velocity profiling, does they match? Let's say if we test on the jumping side, he needs like more strength. Is it gonna be match on the sprinting side?
No, potentially not. Potentially not. So that might be something either. So there's a couple of possible explanations. One, potentially there could be an error in the profiling. Two, you've got a person that is that needs more force jumping, but doesn't need more force when they're sprinting. So you might be applying two different applications. Like it's like a quadrant. There might be sprinting on the Y, jumping on the X, and on the X might be more force, less force. On the Y might be more force, less force. And you might just be able to put your athlete based on what they exhibit into those categories.
Cool. So next thing I want to ask is, on the podcast you did with Rob Pacey, you guys discuss about like relationship between jumping and sprinting. So how exactly does that work? How is that, or like for counter movement jump, like is it just only for like acceleration, and for to mimic like the max speed, what types of like plyo should we do?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll take a step back. When people have looked at research on jumping and sprinting, they might do correlations with athletes amongst the two. Athletes that are faster and more powerful relative to their body weight will jump higher, just in general, than athletes that are lower or less powerful relative to body weight. So there will always be some type of relationship. Most research is about 60% of the relationship, okay, across different sports. As you get to the upper end and elite athletes, those relationships mean less and less, because you're not dealing with a wide spectrum of abilities. Everybody's ability is really similar. So that's just the first disclaimer. Now, if we're just talking about, say, race models, a counter movement jump, it's a slow stretch shortening cycle normally. That would be more related in terms of time domain to something like coming out of the blocks, okay? And it's a bilateral jump. And in my experience, sprinters all had higher counter movement jumps than the long jumpers that I worked with. All right. Even though the long jumpers technically were the better jumpers, the sprinters had the better counter movement jumps, because they do a lot of coming out of the blocks, okay, at those time signatures, versus the long jumpers. They don't do that. They don't have that crouch position where they're expending a lot of force for a long period of time, except in their actual training, like with weights and things like that. So that's a big thing to understand. So the counter movement jump, or in particular squat jump or non-counter movement jump, will be even more related, where there's a pause and you're coming out of a static start. Then as you get closer and closer to maximal sprinting, maximal velocity, there's no plyometric that will mimic that as well as actually sprinting. The time domains are so small, it's like 80 to 100 milliseconds. 2017 World Champs was average of about 90 milliseconds contact time on the ground per leg at maximal velocity. So it's very hard to replicate those times unless you're actually sprinting at that speed. In saying that, though, things that get closer to those time domains are things like your pogo jumps, are things like your drop jumps, your jumps where you spend a limited amount of time on the ground. So anything sort of below 150 milliseconds is probably getting close to having some type of transfer effect for maximum velocity sprinting, especially if there are issues in and around the lower leg with that, because that's potentially what it targets. Like, you don't have enough time for the leg, if you're doing a jump, for the leg to get a lot of knee flexion, a lot of hip flexion. It's almost all ankle when you're doing it. So especially if there's an issue with ankle deformity at maximum velocity, e.g. the ankle's going through too much range, or the ankle's not stiff enough, then yes, it definitely can be related. But yeah, in general, the number one plyometric is sprinting. And if you want to go even further, it's probably overspeed sprinting, where your contact times can even be reduced if you're doing it correctly, or if you're doing it for that particular purpose.
Cool. So for kind of want to go back to the force velocity profiling. So do you use like force velocity profiling for all your athletes, or is it you have to reach like certain level of like strength or certain level of like power so you can use force velocity profiling?
So yeah, you have to be able to jump with a certain amount of weight on your back, just as a function of the test. In my experience, I've used force velocity profiling with like a 3-point method, nothing extra, 30% extra and 60% extra. That doesn't work as well as body weight, 50% extra and 100% of body weight extra. So my preference is for the athletes to be able to jump with 100% of their body weight on their back before you actually do the test. So you can just work up to this in your training, you know what I mean? Like over 4 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever. But they should be able to jump with at least 60% of their body weight, either on a trap bar or on a barbell on their back, before you can even apply a force velocity test, because otherwise you won't be getting heavy enough with the loads, with the jump. The same thing will go with the sprinting. If you're going to do a low velocity test, you don't need the force velocity test that San Zeno does. You don't need that, but you can do low velocity tests with resisted sprinting. But a person has to have pretty at least a little bit of experience sprinting with load, so it doesn't look like it's a totally new thing. If it's a totally new thing for them, you try and give it to them, it'll be a waste of time. That the results you get out will be absolutely worthless, because they've never done it before. They need to be familiar with what the actual test entails. So maybe it's 25% of body weight, 50% of body weight, 75% of body weight with the sprinting over decreasing distances. Maybe it's 30 meters, nothing, 25% of body weight, 20 meters, 50% of body weight, 15 meters, 75% of body weight, 10 meters. And you record the times of all three, and you get this load velocity slope. To do that, to get meaningful results from that, they have to have experience at those weights prior. So it just means you need to build into it with your training, and say there's a 12-week period. After 12 weeks, then you might be able to do it. And saying that, I do a heap of other jump profiling. Like my stock standard would be a counter movement jump, non-counter movement jump, to give you an eccentric utilization ratio, and a counter movement jump with arms. That'll also give me a coordination index, where I can kind of see how well they coordinate their upper body with the lower body with jumping, which is really important. I've had athletes on national teams that I've had to help with jumping with arms compared to their jumping without arms. It's like a third grade PE lesson, because they can't synchronize their arms with their actual lower leg output. Normally not in track and field, but in other sports is what I'm thinking of. But where jumping is still important. Then I might also do a single leg counter movement jump, and I can compare a number of things with the single leg, but left versus right. I can also compare the sum of left and right to the total, to the counter movement jump, which would be a bilateral deficit. Here's some indications of what they might be better at, and depending on the sport, where you might want to go with that. And you can also look at non-counter movement jumps in the single leg, and that'll give you an indication of things like tendon health, also force production from a static start. So all those things I'll do, and another options, probably I'll do those beforehand. I can start with people doing that straight away. Again, they need some familiarization with it, but you might start after, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of training with those type profiles. And then as you progress through, I just alternate them. I go back and forth in my profiling, and they're just embedded in my programs. Probably every 3 to 6 weeks, I'll do one variation of those, and just to keep track of how things are going. I'll also use like pogo tests as well. Sorry, it was the other thing that I didn't mention. Pogo tests, and potentially some drop jumps or depth jumps, depending on what I want to add in like an a la carte fashion to the testing.
Cool. So you mentioned that in sprinting force velocity profiling, if you use like resisted sprinting, you mentioned that there's gonna be like 50% of the body weight, 75% of the body weight, and 100% of the body weight, right?
Sure, you can get up to 100%. It doesn't really matter what you use. All you need is, say, 2 to 3 loads that are heavier than body weight, 2 to 4 loads that are heavier than body weight that the athlete can accelerate with, and you just need to measure the times that it takes them to accelerate. From there, you can build out a load velocity profile.
Cool. So let's say if it's an elite sprinter and he probably can like do resisted sprinting like with very heavy loads, but some of the coaches would debate that if the load is heavier than like 10% of the body weight, it might change their sprint mechanic. So how exactly does that work with like things we just mentioned?
Okay, so firstly, that 10% of your body weight is like rubbish. It's if an athlete that sprints all the time, elite sprinter, their technique is pretty solidified. There might be small changes you can make. If they go and do one session or one part of a session once per week, yes, they might look different when they're doing it, but it's not going to change the technique of them sprinting without any weight, unless you do a truckload of it. And you're not going to be doing a truckload of it. You're always going to be doing most of your work sprinting without any additional load. So those fears are like almost completely unfounded for me. And you'd have to be dealing with an absolute motor moron, like an athlete that wasn't very talented, for that to happen. Because most of the time, if you're dealing with an elite athlete, their sprinting technique is pretty solidified. It might take a year for you to change that if you're purposely trying to change that. And that's a year just to change it in practice repetitions, not in competition. So for it to change just from doing a little bit of resisted work, man, it might be magic, but very unlikely in my mind. So I have no concerns about that or worries about that. It's like a old wives' tale. Of course, they will look different when they're actually doing it. They've got something behind their back or that they're towing. Yes, so yes, they're going to look different. But will that affect their actual sprinting without it? Very likely not.
Cool, man. Cool. So the next, I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into like speed training. I noticed that last year you have your own speed course, right? So
yep, with HIT science.
yeah. So for like acceleration for resisted sprinting, like we just mentioned, like how exactly would you like cooperate or like program it into your like sprint session or like acceleration session? Sorry.
Yeah. So essentially, if I'm the technical coach, this is what I do. We have an acceleration session. They might warm up. We'll do some technical drills. Then we will either contrast acceleration loaded or resisted and free accelerations, or we might do loaded first, then free, like that. After that, after we're finished, then we might do some slow stretch shortening cycle, jumps, bounds, medicine ball throws. That would be a basic template for an acceleration session with an athlete. So warm up, a little bit of technique work, then resisted work, free work, and then slow stretch shortening cycle activity, whatever it is, jumps, bounds, throws. Now the resisted work and the free work, they might be contrasted, where you might do one set of resisted, one set of free, or it might be 2 sets of resisted, 1 set of free. It might be 50% body weight, 25% body weight, free, 50% body weight, 25% body weight, free. 50% body weight, 25% body weight, free. Like that. That's the session. Or it might be 50% body weight, then free. And you might do that a certain amount of times. So that's generally how I'd set it up. Then what happens as say the season progresses and a person's getting closer and closer to a competition, the weight of the resistance relative to the body weight will go down and down and down. Now, if they are a really good accelerator, they'll probably start at less percentage of body weight. If they're a really poor accelerator, they might start at more percentage of body weight. But no matter what, those resistances relative to the body weight will shift as you get closer and closer to competition, where by the end, that acceleration session might not have any resisted work in it. It might all be free. Or it might be, say, 25% of body weight or 10% of body weight as the sort of loads you use. Versus at the start of the season, it might be 100% of body weight and 75% of body weight.
Cool. So it fits for like acceleration session, and we use like 4-point start or like 3-point start. How exactly? Because like for sprinters, they have to be like the mechanic have to be right. You have to like the shin angle must be like go negative. So is there like certain cue you're gonna use with your athletes to like let them like step down on each like side?
Yeah, so generally I'll say bring your feet under your hips. That's the big technical mark, because your feet should be brought back under your hips. And you want to be projecting out. Like it's I really love like Stu McMillan and Dan Paff's work at Altus, and sort of projection. Okay, that's and the rhythm out. Those are the big things. But yeah, bring the foot under the hip. Make sure your feet are under your hips, and being really active with that is the big cue I use. And I'll vary the starting positions. The starting positions will vary based on how much they're working, because it's harder to do a 4-point start than a 3. It's harder to do a 3-point than a 2. So I'll vary those based on what the session is and how much load they're actually working with. But the more load they have, it's actually it's not contradictory, but it's actually a really good point to make. The more load you have on there, the less they have to support their own body weight. So it actually helps the athletes find those really nice positions in acceleration out of the blocks or out of a 3-point start with heavier weights attached to heavier weights, because now there's more of their own body weight that they don't have to carry, and they can get a feel for what type of angle they can sustain without the additional load. So, and sometimes it looks much better than what it does free sprinting with a bit of additional load. Cool. Especially in the first 2 steps. Yeah.
Dude, besides like besides the coaching you mentioned, do you use? I know some of the coaches use like cones. Do you use cones? Yeah. And how to set up those cones for acceleration?
So I use acceleration ladders from Gary Winkler. Gary Winkler. Yeah, Gary Winkler, and maybe I've got that wrong, but I use acceleration ladders. We all put tape on the track. Film on grass. Depends on the athlete. So say I worked with some pro footballers just recently. I'll use cones, and that might be as simple as what I call a German ladder. You do a meter, and then you just increase the distance by 10% every step they take. So it might be a meter, meter 10, meter 21, meter 33, like that as you go on. But acceleration ladders, I have those all the way from like say 11 to 100 meters all the way down to 10, 100 meters, and based on how far. And I love them because it gives people consistency of stride length, so they know how much to put out and what type of stride length they'll have to hit to make a certain time. I always work at a ladder that is not at their PB. So say, for instance, I'm expecting a person to run a 10.6. I might be working off a 10.8 ladder with them in training. But that's how it works in general.
Cool.
And as they get faster and faster, we move closer and closer.
How about, so that's the things for like acceleration. How about like things like for max velocity? Is there like certain like things you're gonna use or certain thing you're gonna look at when you train like max velocity?
For sure, for sure. The mechanics first and foremost. So mechanics, I'll look at acceleration, mechanics, and max velocity first and foremost. From there, a lot of my work's dictated off like say flying 30 times or flying 10 or flying 20 times. From there, I'll be able to project what speeds I want out of any distance, essentially, in a sprint workout. There you can use resisted work, you can use assisted work, e.g. overspeed work, based on what they're looking like. So I might use both. You can use loaded work as well, like weight vests or ankle weights or wrist weights when they're sprinting. So these little micro loadings, Exogen is a system that's like really, it's like the Ferrari of ankle weights or micro loading. So I'll use that as well at maximum velocity. I really like that. So all those things will be tools that I might use for maximum velocity sprinting. And mini hurdles, of course. Mini hurdles, ins and outs and mini hurdles. Those will help me give an athlete what it feels like to run at a certain stride length. So say, for instance, I've got a person whose stride frequency is really good, but their stride length is poor. I'll play around with them. Like, okay, your stride frequency is great. It's maybe 4.5 hertz, but your stride length, we need it to be, say, at least, I don't know, for your time that you want to run, say 2.1 meters. You are currently at 1.9. Let's give you a feel for what 1.95 feels like. Once we've got that, let's give you a feel for what 2 feels like. Okay, so you can feel that, still keep good form through that. Okay, that type of stride length, that type of projection is what we need when you're actually running free now. So then I'll take mini hurdles out. It might be a set of, say, instead of just doing 20, 30 mini hurdles in a row, then we might take out 5 in the middle, 20 in the middle, or it might be every second one gets taken out, and I'll vary that with the athlete just as a way of skill acquisition with them.
Cool. So can you like walk us through, let's say, the whole week for a sprinter? It's like the weekly layout for a sprinter's training, no matter it's like the technical session or like weight training session.
Yeah, so look, there's so many different. I actually love discussing this stuff around weekly setups and what to do and when to do it. There's so many different options. In general, so for in a SIG week, the general rule of thumb is a high day, low day, high day, low day, high day, low day, something like that. So you might come back on a Monday. Monday might actually be a low day where you're doing some activation work, some potentiation work, something like that. Tuesday might be an acceleration day with heavier weights on the Tuesday. Wednesday, a recovery day, tempo recovery, and it'll be pretty easy. It might be in the pool even. Thursday, maximum velocity in the gym, snappier, faster stuff. Essentially, like a more of a power session in the gym. Friday, again, active recovery, easy. Again, might be in the pool, might be on the track. Then Saturday speed endurance. Okay, so this is sort of 80 meters plus type work. That would be a general template for a week with an athlete. Sunday off, start again on Monday. Now, if you only have 5 days with an athlete, it might be Monday is your acceleration, Tuesday is your tempo, Wednesday is your maximum velocity, Thursday is your pull, Friday is your speed endurance. And they're just variations upon those.
So you mentioned that there's going to be like tempo and like speed endurance. How exactly is it different with those two?
So speed endurance is running like close to maximal, like above, say, technically above 90% of your maximum velocity for that particular distance. And it's anything above 80 meters, essentially. So it might be 80 to 150 meters. It might be even 150 to 300. You might call that special endurance. And in some cases, it might even be longer than that. It might be like 450s, I don't know, or 400s. Like Carl Lewis, for instance, when he's coaching at University of Houston, has a 400, 300, 200 workout that he uses for all his sprinters. And that would be speed endurance. Tempo, on the other hand, is at much lower speeds. You're talking like 60% of maximum velocity. Sometimes, depending on what coaches term it, you have things called extensive tempo, intensive tempo, and tempo recovery. Tempo recovery is normally lower heart rate. It's a recovery tool, and it's designed for athletes to get blood flow going and to get fit to the actual running, essentially. Now, one of the big things with tempo days is a lot of times it's really easy for athletes to slip into sloppy mechanics because it's longer work, it's slower, they might not be as focused as well. It's a recovery day. So one of the big things I do with that is I really like making sure the mechanics are good, and I'll use different variations of step over drills or dribbles. So they might do, their tempo days might actually just be a day full of dribbling or step overs. So they might do 60 meters, step overing for their tempo, things like that, just to make sure our mechanics are really sound and mechanics become a component of them running even when they are fatigued and when they're not running fast. So that's the kind of difference between speed endurance and tempo. Of course, some intensive tempo might get up above like between 80 to 90% of your maximal speed, but most of the time it's definitely below the sort of 60%.
So that's kind of the question for like sprinting. Want to go back to like for jumping. If the athlete couldn't, like, let's say it's just a high school athlete and doesn't have like the strength or the power to do a barbell or like trap bar on his body to do a jump squat, how exactly would you improve his jumping ability or like jump height?
So yeah, if they can't do that, highly likely their jump height will just improve by being able to jump with more weight on. So I would keep working with them. I would be able to go in there and I would say, look, I'm going to save you a lot of time and money. We're just going to get you good at jumping with some weight on your back. Okay. When you can do that, then come back to me and we will have a look at how you jump at heavier weights, how you jump at lighter weights, and we'll figure out a plan for you. But to start with, you just need to get better at jumping with a bit more load.
So what's the goal for him before he get into contact with you?
Say he should be able to jump with at least, or he or she should be able to jump with at least 60% of their body weight and feel comfortable doing that.
Cool, man. Cool. So after that, we can use like force velocity profiling, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So, besides force velocity profiling for sprinting and jumping, is there, let's say, like team sport athlete like basketball or like rugby you played, and like American football? Is there like certain like tests you recommended coaches to use?
So yeah, I would well, those jump profiles you can use across all sports, just depending on how much or how little you want to use of them, and based on your time in the team setting. Normally, I'd recommend like both those. It depends what you can apply to. I'm a big believer in not just testing once, because you never know how an athlete might turn up on a particular day. There might be a lot of noise. You want to embed your testing into your program so the noise kind of gets filled out. If you do enough of it, the noise of the test, the day-to-day variation that an athlete might turn up with. Some days they might turn up on fire. Some days they might turn up really depressed and down. So you might not know that if you only ever test once every 3 months or once every 6 months. You might just get them on a bad day, or you might get them on a great day. You don't know that. So I embed things as much as possible in my testing. So it's every sort of 3 to 6 weeks that we'll be picking up things. And we might even be picking up things weekly. But yeah, I would definitely be looking at a force velocity profile for your court sports, for your field sports. For the field sports, I'd probably lean more towards the actual sprinting stuff if I was going to put an importance on it. Because they'll do more of that than actual jumping, versus the court sports will probably do more jumping than actual sprinting. So it's just like a priority system based on what they actually do in the sport. But yeah, 100%, I would be using those with any court or field sport athlete that came my way.
Great. So That's kind of like all the questions I have for today. So for those coaches who are interested in the content we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you? And is there going to be another like speed course next year?
Yeah, so look, so if you want to reach out, Instagram is probably the best place at Joseph Coyne. Also on Twitter at Joseph Coyne, JOSEPHCOYNE. So that's the best place to reach out. There is, as you mentioned, Eric, the course with Hit Science. Hit Science is some awesome courses there, not just in and around speed. They've also got another one besides mine, which is developing maximal sprinting speed, with Peter Wayand, who's and it's about the anaerobic speed reserve, which is a great course as well. So highly recommend those. And yeah, look, that course, I don't know if I'll do like a second one of that. That one's pretty much what I want to produce, but there might be some refinements to it. There's heaps of ideas or things that I haven't quite managed to put in there, in the structure that we had that definitely I think should be part and parcel of learning how to teach people how to run fast, and ways of making people run fast. And what happens is you can only put so much stuff into a course, right? And so there's heaps of other things that we can add on to it. But at the moment, that's it, and highly recommend it. Check it out. Hit Science, HIIT, Science, SCINCE.com. It's on there. And they've got other courses around high intensity interval training as well that I'd highly recommend.
Cool. So besides like the speed course, is there like are you going to work with like elite athlete in the future?
Yeah, you bet. So I still work with, say, some pro footballers. A high jumper that I used to work with. He's come out and doing some camps with me. He just did one recently in the last year, and we'll be back out this year hopefully, for a number of camps. And then I coach athletics out of the schools I work with, and I also help out with some sprint swimmers as well, which has been really interesting. So I use a lot of the things I've been talking about today with these sprint swimmers to enhance their block starts and make them more powerful off the blocks and faster off the blocks.
Great. That's all for today, man. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on, buddy.